In the next 20 minutes, I have about 30 seconds per slide. I'm going to talk first of all about Mappiness. Now Mappiness actually launched in 2010, so some of this is sort of old hats again. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what Mappiness is that will help you understand what on earth I'm talking about. Then I'm going to talk what's better about these data. Maybe they're not better than your data, this is a slightly loaded term, isn't it? But today is better data, so why is this data so useful that we can collect ourselves using smartphones? And then finally, my shameless plug is how can I collect these data, and that's mainly by paying me money. Although many other options exist, there are lots of other ways to collect this data too, I'm sure. And so about 9 years ago, actually, just before I say that, I should also apologise that I wasn't able to catch all of the talks that came before me, so if I say anything that sounds repetitive or contradictory or misses connections, then sorry, put me right in the questions or afterwards. 9 years ago I started a PhD at LSE on happiness and environmental quality, and the first half of the PhD kind of got into web surveys and GIS and relatively boring, didn't get all that far, didn't find very much. And in the second half, sort of the last 18 months of the PhD, I had this idea for an iPhone app called Mappiness, and that was an idea actually that would have been hard to have right at the start, because right at the start there wasn't an iPhone and then there weren't apps for the iPhone, and so the timing was good. So there was this idea for an app called Mappiness to collect data on happiness and environmental quality and how happy people are in different kinds of environments. Mappiness is basically designed to answer this question, right? It's fairly clear that green space makes us happy, but exactly how happy does green space make us? It's important to know that kind of quantitative element. That matters if you want policymakers to take your argument seriously. Does it make more or less happy than this much extra income, or all these other things that we could do as policymakers? And before Mappiness, and to some extent I guess still, the evidence on this has been relatively thin. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into the literature review. One of the things I could talk about, I guess, is why we might expect any kind of relationship between green space or pleasant environments and happiness. And there are sort of three broad reasons to come back to the topic that Susie got questioned on at the beginning. Maybe I'll just give you a very brief overview. We might think that there's biophilia, maybe there are kind of evolutionary explanations for us enjoying the sorts of environments that we evolved in until very recently when we sort of moved more into cities. There might be higher levels of environmental quality, lower levels of air pollution, noise, and other things that make us unhappy in those environments. And those environments might be associated with lots of other things that make us happy. So with going out with friends, with doing physical exercise, and with that kind of thing. So those are the sort of the three main reasons why we might hypothesize a positive relationship between green space and happiness. But the ways that people had looked at this were either sort of lab studies that were very well controlled, but often didn't either involve real natural environments, but instead involved kind of slides or videos, and weren't very closely related to people's everyday lives and what they do in their everyday lives. Or there were observational studies where sometimes in economics people had looked at sort of the average happiness of whole countries and the average environmental quality in those whole countries, and tried to relate those two things together, where there's really no very convincing kind of exposure link between the people to the environment and their happiness. Or maybe they're at the individual level and they were kind of limited to looking at where people live and what the environment was like there, which is better, but still doesn't give you a very direct link. Right? People actually are probably exposed to natural environments largely when they're not at home, because when they're at home they're indoors. They're much more likely to be exposed while they're commuting or on holiday or in various places that they don't live. So, how does Mappiness work? How was Mappiness designed to try and improve on that relatively thin evidence on the relationship between happiness and green space? Well, Mappiness I can download for free from the App Store, and so can you. iOS 10 has broken it a little bit. You have to turn off photos or the thing freezes, because it was designed a very long time ago, but it does still work. It takes 2 or 3 minutes to sign up, and you agree to take part, you answer some simple questions, demographic questions, and you confirm that you're going to be beeped twice a day until further notice. I get a beep like that at a random moment twice a day, very much like receiving a text. It looks a bit different from that nowadays, doesn't it? And then I do a survey. And this repeated survey was sort of designed to be as quick and as easy as possible. So I report my feelings on a kind of visual analog scale. I give some basic context for controlling and regressions about who I'm with, where I am, what I'm doing. While I'm answering, it's taking the sound level, and crucially it's taking the GPS location from the phone. And then when I'm finished, all that data is sent back to the server, and I can get a simple breakdown of my responses in the form of charts or as raw data online. I could get it, I could subscribe to it in my calendar and see how I felt alongside my appointments, say. So individuals get back all the data that they contribute to us individually, which helps them, I think, feel like they're participants and not just sort of respondents or subjects in the traditional sense. Oh, here we go. I didn't realise that was a map. I can then, that's me at my desk at home. So I can also see the photos that I took and what I was doing at the time on a map there. Various formats that you can get your own data back in. Mapping has got some wonderful coverage in the media. We had a piece on CNN, and once it was on CNN, all the other journalists were like, oh, it must be news, it was on CNN, and it got covered in various other kinds of places, including the front page of the Figaro, lots and lots of other media coverage. I think launching in August is a good idea because nothing else is going on, Parliament's away on holiday and so on. And we got featured in the App Store, and so, I thought for a PhD, maybe I'll get a few dozen or a few hundred people doing it for a couple of weeks, and that would be enough for a thesis, but actually, as Sophie said, we got millions of responses from tens of thousands of people, which is still slowly growing. And so we've got data that we can do an awful lot with, and I will talk in a minute about all the things that we can do with that data and why that data is so particularly great. My main interest, though, as I was saying, was in links between happiness and people's immediate environment. And so the way to get at that was to join habitat data with each response location. This is the Land Cover Map 2000. There is now a more up-to-date version, the Land Cover Map 2007. Well, that didn't come out till quite a long time after 2007. And this is a high-resolution, remote-sensed data set about habitat type, and this is London, you may have spotted. You can see the Thames wriggling through the middle there. Black is what they call a continuous urban land cover type, and we have a lot of that in London. But you can also see Hyde Park over here, which is made up of a variety of kinds of natural environments. So it's not just about being in the countryside, it's not just rural areas, it's habitats wherever they occur that we're looking at in this mappiness research. And then once that's done, I put all the information that we've collected into one big regression model, and that regression model tries to predict people's subjective happiness response based on all of these things together, all controlled for each other. The key point, they all go in together, so every effect should be controlled for every other effect, but we have habitat type in there, we have weather conditions, we have whether it's daylight or not, we have what they're doing, who they're with, the kind of location they're in, the time of the day of the week, number of responses they've given before in case there's a trend, which there is, there's a sort of slight positive trend over time. People get happier while they're responding. And individual fixed effects. So this is just a within individual comparison. This is only estimated on the within individual effect. It's equivalent to putting a dummy variable in for each individual participant. So what do we find? To get a feel for the size of the effects, here are the happiest activities that we find. The first one there wasn't originally in the options that people had, because people probably had better things on their mind, but we did have lots of emails saying that people would like that to be added, and hopefully they didn't all have someone looking over their shoulder while they were answering, that might help them down on their responses. But anyway, that's the happiest activity in the data set. The bars chart the regression coefficients from this fixed effect regression, right? So that's a coefficient of 13. The response variable is scaled from 0 to 100%, so you can sort of think of that as a 13% change in happiness. And then the little black bars are the confidence, the 95% confidence interval. So these coefficients are all very highly significant. So apart from that top activity, all the others are sort of cultural or physical activities, and we sort of find a range of sort of 4 to 6 points. People are happier by 4 to 6 points doing those things than when they're not doing those things. And then the focus of the research, land cover, how do those sizes measure up? Actually, they measure up in a way that's reasonably equivalent. So what we find is that any natural environment is happier than the continuous urban environment. Coastal margins, this is sort of wetlands and estuaries. It's not just any kind of coastline. It's wetlands and estuaries are by far the happiest environments. And coming back again to Susie's first question, I'm not exactly sure why that is. It would be interesting to look at it more. I know there is more research on green and blue space being done, including by people at Plymouth, I think. But in any case, all natural environments are happier than the continuous urban environment. The continuous urban environment is the omitted category here, so these are all relative to the continuous urban environment. And these results stand up to a variety of different kinds of robustness checks and some completely different ways of defining natural environments. So we could look instead at areas of outstanding natural beauty, national nature reserves, and so on, and we find similar magnitude effects there that are very significant. Obviously there are some limitations which I haven't gone into, such as, for example, the representativeness of our sample. Our sample is not at all representative because it's people who had iPhones fairly early, they're younger, they're richer, and they're more likely to be in either employment or education and less likely to be unemployed or retired than your average UK resident. But nevertheless, I think this still represents a strong line of evidence on links between the environment and happiness. We had a paper several years ago now in Global Environmental Change. There's a link here where you can read all of that. And so that effectively is happiness. I'm not sure if Susie mentioned it before I managed to come in, but we've got a little bit of work relating this to the scenic or not data, where we found that people in scenic environments are also happier, which is sort of a similar kind of hypothesis, I suppose. Now, what's better about this data? What's so useful about collecting data in this way? Well, there are kind of three things I want to talk about. The first thing is that the data is longitudinal, or as economists certainly say, it's got a panel structure, right? So we've got many responses from each of many individuals, and what that lets us do is you could do a random effects model, but in economics it's much more common to do a fixed effects model. But in either case, we can sort of distinguish the within individual variation and the between individual variation. But the within individual variation is particularly useful with some of this sort of subjective data. It kind of makes your subjective data, in a sense, more objective, because you know that this person's 5 out of 10 is a relatively happy answer for them, this other person's 5 out of 10 is a relatively miserable answer for them. So you get to compare people around their own average and see how things affect them and not be confounded potentially by sort of unobservable individual level effects. And for example, in the context of happiness, we can be fairly sure that we're not confounded by just finding different kinds of people up mountains than we find in gardens, in wetlands and so on, than we find in urban environments, because we're only using the within individual variation. Now, for example, here's a particular green space in London, here's Buckingham Palace Gardens. It might be that when you ask people in Buckingham Palace Gardens how happy they feel, they tell you they feel quite happy, but then you might argue that's just because the kind of people you find in Buckingham Palace Gardens. But with the fixed effects model, within individual variation only, we know that that same person maybe is happier in Buckingham Palace Gardens than when they're somewhere else in the city. And so we know that we can't be led astray there by an individual level effect. So we've got a longitudinal panel structure, which is great. The data is also big. Now, it's millions of rows. It easily fits on one computer, it easily fits on this computer that I'm presenting from. So it's, it's an awful lot smaller than some other kinds of really big data. But for social science researchers, it's still on the large side. And generally, of course, if you're looking for statistically significant results, if you're doing quantitative research, not slavishly following p-values, but generally you want a bigger sample to tell you more. And that turns out to be particularly useful in happiness, for example, because people aren't outdoors all that much of the time. They're outdoors about 8% of the time across the year, a little bit more in summer, a little bit less in winter. When they're outdoors, they're not in nature that often. And when they're in nature, they're still not, for example, up a mountain very often. And so out of the several million responses that we have, we still only have on the order of a few hundred responses from people who are up mountains. And that's enough to find effects, but it's not kind of a massive, massively more than we need. It's enough, but not that much more. It may also be that the original happiness required you to have mobile phone reception in order to be signalled, and that could be a problem far away up mountains. But in any case, having a big data set gives you an awful lot more potential to discover effects that you're looking for. And then the third reason that this data is really useful, and final reason, is that it's rich in the sense that there's sort of lots to it as it comes, but it's also very easily joined with other data sets through the things that we collect. The things that we collect include GPS location, as I've said, timestamp, and a photo. And so, for example, with a GPS location, we can capture land cover, as we saw. We can also kind of capture whether it's an urban or a rural environment. We could link to various kinds of administrative geographies like local authorities, health authorities, wards, or proximity to certain kinds of features. And for example, I did a back of the envelope calculation at some point when the Cabinet Office was asking about the potential social benefits of pubs. And so we looked very briefly at people in the happiness data set who said they were drinking. And we find that, on average, drinking has a positive effect in our data set. We did various kinds of interaction, so that the main effect is positive, interaction with being on your own is negative, but the thing that we were particularly interested in was the interaction of drinking and being near a pub, as outlined in the OpenStreetMap data set, which is not completely comprehensive or accurate. But very indicatively, we find that when people are drinking in a pub, they're happier than when they're simply drinking. So there seems to be some positive effect of being in the pub. And we still don't know how much is being drunk or what they're drinking, but happiness is greater in the 5 bars. There's possibly a follow-up paper, or in fact, more seriously, a recent paper with a co-author, Ben Bamberg-Geiger, who did very much the majority of the work, finds that people are happier in the happiness data set when they're drinking. They're a little bit more tired the next day, although the next day their happiness is not affected. And he also uses the British cohort study to sort of give this a sort of longer term and representative angle too. So just with that location data, we can tell quite a lot. Another example, I did some work for the Arts Council England. These are responses that are in or around the British Museum, and we looked at responses generally near large arts venues. The result was relatively boring, but probably for the best. People are very happy in arts venues, and there's very little difference between the kind of arts venue in relation to how happy they are, which probably they're relieved about. So we had GPS location. We also have timestamp, and that means that we can link our data to national events, global events, movements of the stock market, and also sort of daily, weekly, yearly rhythms. And this picture is some quite dense descriptive data of happiness over the course of a year in the UK. So it moves from the 1st of September 2010 at the top to the 31st of August 2011 at the bottom, so it's kind of, there's a line per day over the course of a year. It moves from 8 AM in the morning on the left to 10 PM at night on the right, and crucially, lighter colours mean happier average responses. And so you can see a lot from this straight away. Right? You can see that there are weekends because there's a kind of stripe, a sort of light stripes on a fairly predictable rhythm there. People are happier at the weekend. You can see that people are also generally happier in the evening. There's this tendency for it to be pretty black first thing in the day, and then move quite to a much lighter shade over towards the right. And you can also pick out particular events. So you can see about 1/3 of the way down there's a very bright line, which is Christmas Day, and about 2/3 of the way down there's the May bank holidays, April May bank holidays. People really don't enjoy working, which is the subject of another paper. And it's a little bit paradoxical because unemployment is disastrous for your longer term well-being, but for your moment-to-moment well-being, being at work is terrible, and that's partly what this is telling us. And we can get that because we have this precise timestamp associated with the data that people give us. Now, if we use timestamp and GPS location together, we get another class of data that sort of vary over space and time. So we can look at weather, as we did in happiness. We could also look at air pollution, which is something on my list to look at in the near future, and various kinds of local events. And one of the kinds of local events that we've begun to try and look at, and this isn't finished yet, is to look at football. So we know that people tell us that they're at a match or a sporting event sometimes, and we can look for those, amongst those, at ones that happen at about 3 o'clock on a Saturday. And then with that, we've got a data set on matches being played, and we've got another data set on what's the home stadium of each team. And from that, we can figure out when people are at a football match, what match they were watching. If we see them at 2 matches, we've got a good idea which team they support, because it's the team that was common between the 2 matches. And from that point, we can then follow those responses across the whole football season and see how people feel in relation to different results from their team, and also other things that might be happening. Does everybody in the country, apart from Man U fans, feel happy when Man U loses, for example? I'm not a football supporter myself, but I'm told that's a plausible hypothesis. So this is nice, and we never thought of collecting the data for this purpose, but having timestamp and location gives you a huge range of possibilities in terms of what you can do. So far, it looks like the big driver of whether people feel good or bad in relation to football results is unexpected losses. And that's, I guess, what you might expect from the kind of behavioural economics literature, but an unexpected loss seems to sort of drive a positive correlation between results for your team and how you feel. That is by far the biggest impact. And we're able to tell that because we've also got data on what the bookmakers' odds were for any particular match. And so we know whether that result, not only the winner or loss, but also whether people are likely to have anticipated it. Finally, another example of the sort of the richness of the data is that when people are outside in happiness, we ask them to take a photo. And there's lots more that could be done here, I'm sure, but as a very, very simple first step, I decided I'd count the proportion of green pixels, because I was looking at green spaces, so let's literally look at how green the spaces are. And this shows the computer classifying in a kind of nasty, garish green anything that it thought was approximately green. And interestingly, the amount of green is strongly correlated with happiness before we control for anything else that we know. Once we control for the other things that we know, that effect goes away. So perhaps it's simply that people don't like being at work, and workplaces generally don't have a lot of green in them, for example. But this is the kind of thing that could be extended, and in particular, I think it would be interesting to try to extend this with sort of machine learning or other kinds of things where we identify things that are in the photo or other characteristics of the photo. So those are the three reasons why I think this data is really so exciting, and certainly has given me a lot to do. How can you collect these data? Well, as I was saying, I've co-founded a company that consults on and builds apps of this kind, and we've already been working with academics in a number of places to launch apps of this sort. So Sophie has her MOOQ app, and we have apps with researchers at Northeastern, in Amsterdam, in San Francisco, and so on, measuring things using a platform which now is on both iOS and Android, and makes it relatively simple to make really nice native apps that do this kind of data collection. Thank you.